The afternoon sun shimmered on the water, warm and golden, the kind of light that made everything feel peaceful, even invincible. I was carving clean, glassy turns across the lake on my Sea-Doo, feeling the spray on my arms and the throttle hum beneath my grip. It had been a long week, and this was my therapy, my private lake, my private land. That's when I saw her. She stood stiffly at the edge of her manicured lawn, hands on hips, like some suburban scarecrow, rigid, unamused, and ready for battle. Karen Prescott, HOA president, self-appointed guardian of the neighborhood's aesthetic harmony, and a woman who seemed allergic to joy. I throttled down, letting the jet ski idle as I coasted toward the dock where my cousin Nate was setting up a camera. We were building a YouTube channel about rural life, off-grid tech, and lake fun. So far, it had been nothing but good vibes and peaceful weekends. Oh, Nate muttered, flicking his phone to record. The Queen approaches. Karen didn't wave. She pointed. "Mr. Thorne," she shouted across the water like I was an unruly schoolboy. "This is a community. We do not allow motorized vehicles on the lake." I pulled off my life vest and walked onto the dock, squinting at her from across the cattails that separated my land from the back end of her property. "That's a problem," I said, smiling, "because this lake doesn't belong to your community." She pursed her lips like she'd bitten a lemon. "It touches the community boundary. That makes it subject to our HOA regulations. Check the bylaws." "I don't live in your HOA," I reminded her, "and neither does this lake." She turned on her heel and stormed off. But her exit wasn't a retreat. It was a declaration of war. That evening, taped to my ranch gate, was a letter printed on HOA letterhead. Notice of violation. Unauthorized use of motorized watercraft in community-adjacent waters. Per Covenant 14b, all lakes bordering residential property shall remain non-motorized to preserve tranquility and environmental balance. I read it 3 times, just to be sure it was as ridiculous as it sounded. Nate leaned over my shoulder. "Did they just invent a rule for a lake they don't own?" "Oh, they're not just inventing," I said, folding the letter and slipping it into my back pocket. "They're escalating." Karen hadn't always been a problem. When the HOA first expanded into the adjacent subdivision 5 years ago, we kept to ourselves. My land, a 40-acre ranch passed down from my grandfather, wasn't part of their jurisdiction, and I liked it that way. They built fences. I planted trees. They paved sidewalks. I dug trails. They put up neighborhood watch signs. I put up cameras. But lately, Karen had taken her role too seriously. First, she filed a complaint about the rooster crowing at dawn. Then, she sent someone to measure the height of my back fence. And now, apparently, she'd appointed herself ruler of the water. I returned to the dock the next morning, slipping the jet ski back into the lake. It was calm, still, a perfect mirror of the sky. I hit the ignition, and the engine purred to life like a warning bell. By my second loop around the far cove, I spotted her again, this time with binoculars. She was scribbling something furiously into a notepad. I smiled, leaned into the throttle, and made a wide turn that sprayed a mist over the reeds closest to her yard. I wasn't trying to start a war, but I also wasn't about to be bullied off my own land by someone who mistook a title for power. Back at the dock, Nate was waiting, shaking his head. "She's going to snap." "Let her," I said, grabbing a towel. "I've got the deed, the survey, and every legal document that proves this lake is mine." "Still," he said, glancing back toward the subdivision, "you might want to keep your boots close. I've got a feeling this isn't over." I looked across the water, where Karen had disappeared behind her hedge line. Something told me Nate was right. This wasn't about noise. It wasn't about water. It was about control. And Karen Prescott didn't like anything she couldn't control. But she'd picked the wrong lake, the wrong land, and the wrong man. And the ripples she'd started? They were about to become waves. It happened the next Saturday, less than a week after Karen's letter, and just as the sun was beginning to dip low behind the Pine Ridge. Nate and I had just finished filming a segment on the solar irrigation setup when the sound of distant sirens punched through the calm like a slap. I paused mid-sentence. Nate lowered the camera slowly. "You hear that?" he said. "Yep." Seconds later, 2 sheriff cruisers rolled up our gravel drive, kicking up a trail of dust behind them. A third SUV, a black one with community watch magnets slapped on the side, followed like a ghost car trailing a funeral. Karen. She climbed out of the passenger seat, arms folded tight, flanked by 2 other HOA board members, Donald, the retired insurance adjuster who hated dogs, and Cheryl, who once tried to fine her neighbor for hanging laundry on a sunny day. One of the deputies stepped forward, hand resting casually on his belt. "Afternoon. You the owner of this property?" I nodded. "I am, Jack Thorne. We got a call about illegal motorized watercraft activity on a restricted body of water." Nate barked a laugh behind me. "You've got to be kidding." Karen stepped forward, her voice tight with satisfaction. "This lake violates Section 14B of our HOA covenant. We've filed multiple complaints. He's refused to comply." I could feel the heat creeping into my chest. "This lake is on my private land. I don't live in your HOA. Never have, never will." One of the deputies scratched his chin, clearly uncomfortable. "Do you have proof of ownership, Mr. Thorne?" I didn't answer. I walked inside the ranch house, pulled the leather-bound deed folder from my safe, and came back out. I handed it to him without a word. He flipped through the pages, brow furrowing. "This says the entire lake, shoreline to shoreline, is on your property. No easement, no shared access." "Exactly." Karen's face drained of color, then flushed red. But it touches the subdivision. Our bylaws." The second deputy, a woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, cut in. "Ma'am, HOA bylaws don't apply to properties outside of your jurisdiction. This man's not a member. You can't enforce anything here," Donald sputtered. Cheryl looked like she might faint. Karen tried again. "He's disturbing the peace." "I'm jet skiing on my own lake," I replied. "You live a quarter mile away. The only reason you're hearing anything is because you're spying." The fine deputy handed the deed back to me. "Sorry to waste your time, Mr. Thorne. You're not doing anything illegal. Enjoy your weekend." They turned back toward the cruisers, but Karen wasn't done. "This isn't over," she snapped. "We'll file a civil complaint." I raised my eyebrows. "Go ahead. Just know that every second you waste trying to take my lake is a second I'll spend making your lives legally miserable." She turned sharply, nearly tripping over a root. Donald muttered something about entitled ranchers, and Cheryl gasped when she saw Nate filming the entire encounter from the porch. "You'll regret this," Karen said. "I doubt that." As the cars disappeared back down the road, the dust settled, but the air didn't. There was something charged now, something unspoken. Karen had tried to escalate things to a legal level and she'd failed. But it didn't feel like a surrender. It felt like a pause. "She's gonna double down," Nate said, lowering the camera. "This isn't about rules anymore." "No," I said. "It's about pride." I went back to the lake that evening, jet ski left idle, sitting on the dock, with a beer in hand. The water was still again, but beneath it, I could sense the turbulence building. Karen couldn't stand the idea of losing, especially not to someone who refused to kneel. I thought about putting up a bigger fence, maybe some motion-triggered lights along the far property line. But part of me wanted her to come again, to try, to bring every scrap of fake authority she had and run it straight into the wall of the truth. Let her send lawyers. Let her call town hall. Let her waste her life chasing control she'd never have. I owned this land. I owned this lake, and I wasn't done yet. By Monday, the peace was gone. I found a letter in my mailbox, this one thicker, an envelope stuffed with printed complaints, so-called evidence, and a cease and desist from the HOA's legal committee. Their letterhead looked official. The threats, less so. Due to multiple violations of Section 14B and endangerment of nearby community members, we are seeking an injunction against the use of motorized vehicles on the lake adjacent to Oak Hollow Estates. Failure to comply may result in fines and civil action. I laughed out loud. Adjacent? That was their new angle? That anything near their picket-fenced suburbia automatically fell under their rule? Nate skimmed the papers with a whistle. They must have paid a lawyer for this. Doubt it, I muttered. Probably downloaded a template and threw some HOA buzzwords into it. But I wasn't about to sit idle. I scanned every page, flagged each legal bluff, and contacted my attorney, Melissa Duke. She'd handled my land dispute years ago, when a gas company tried to sneak in a pipeline. Sharp as a whip, she was born for battles like this. Within hours, Melissa called me back. They don't have a leg to stand on, she said. Zero legal claim to your property, but they're betting you'll get tired. Most people do. Well, I'm not most people. Good, she said, because they just filed a formal complaint with the county clerk's office. You're on their radar now. That night, I didn't sleep much. I stared at the lake from my bedroom window, moonlight dancing across the surface. This wasn't just about jet skis anymore. Karen and her cronies were testing boundaries, pushing to see how far they could bully someone outside their realm. The next morning, I discovered the real escalation. They'd built a fence. A 6-foot-tall, freshly installed barrier, right along the narrow strip where my land came within visual distance of their subdivision's walking path. It didn't cross the boundary. It was just close enough to make a point. On it hung a metal sign. Private property. HOA. Residents only. Trespassers will be prosecuted. Nate stared at it, jaw dropped. They're marking your land as theirs. Not technically, I said. But the implication is loud and infuriating. I called the county zoning office. The fence wasn't approved, no permits. It was technically legal to install, fencing on private land. But theirs encroached by 6 inches into my property. That's all I needed. Let's film it, I told Nate. He raised his brows. Now? Now. We rolled camera. I introduced myself, explained the situation, and documented the fence with GPS coordinates, property lines, and all. Then I handed the footage to Melissa. She filed a counter-complaint, citing property line, violation, and harassment. That same day, she drafted a letter to the HOA board. This one wasn't a bluff. It was a warning shot. But Karen? She didn't take the hint. Later that week, I caught her on my security feed, standing near the fence on my side, with 2 clipboard-carrying assistants measuring noise levels from a small handheld decibel reader. I watched the footage with narrowed eyes. She's building a case. She's building a fantasy, Nate said. The next morning, I set up speakers on the dock, just for fun. Played old country rock, moderate volume, but enough to get under the skin of anyone straining to find fault. Sure enough, Karen showed up, again. This time she shouted across the cattails, accusing me of hosting unauthorized events, claimed it was disturbing community pets, said someone's labradoodle had anxiety now. I just waved and turned the music up 1 notch. Later that afternoon, I took the jet ski out again. The sun was blazing, the water cool, and as I sped across the lake, I caught sight of Karen standing on her 2nd-floor balcony, phone aimed at me like a weapon, probably live-streaming her evidence. Good. Let her. Because the trap was nearly set. While Karen waged her petty war of paper threats and passive-aggressive property lines, Melissa had been working on something bigger, something that would turn the tables once and for all. The deed, the original county maps, and the surveyor's data were now compiled into a single, bulletproof legal document. The plan? One decisive move that would make the HOA regret ever touching this fight. I pulled back into the dock, water dripping from the Sea-Doo's hull. Nate met me with a grin and a dry towel. "How much longer until the hammer drops?" he asked. I looked across the lake, toward the HOA's picket-fenced illusion of control. "Soon," I said. "And when it does, I want every camera rolling." The morning of the final showdown arrived with a sky as clear as glass, and the kind of silence that feels unnatural, like the land itself was waiting for something to snap. Melissa had chosen this day carefully. The county commissioner's office was holding its quarterly land usage hearing, and on the docket, thanks to a little nudge, was Case 874C. Improper HOA claim of jurisdiction over non-member private property. My property. Karen showed up in a beige pantsuit like she was going to war at a garden party. Her 2 shadow board members flanked her like loyal lieutenants. They were smug, whispering among themselves, convinced the county would side with the organized body over the stubborn, jet-skiing rancher. They didn't know what Melissa had prepared. We brought evidence, pages of legal documentation, decades-old property lines, a professional video package, thank you, Nate, and statements from 2 of my neighbors attesting to the HOA's harassment. The commissioner leaned back in his chair as Melissa spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen, this isn't just about jet skis. It's about precedent. If this HOA can assert power beyond its legal boundaries, what's to stop them from creeping across property lines all over the state?" Karen leapt to her feet. "He's disrupting our peace. We have rules, standards. He's out here running a water circus next to our homes. He lives over 700 feet from your border," Melissa snapped. "Your bylaws have no reach there." The commissioner held up a hand. "Ms. Langford," he said, addressing Karen by name. "I've reviewed the survey maps. I've seen the video evidence. I've seen the deed. You have no jurisdiction over Mr. Thorne's lake. Your recent fence project even encroaches on his land by 0.57 feet. That will need to be corrected immediately." Karen blinked. "But, additionally," the commissioner continued, "if your board files one more baseless complaint or initiates contact with Mr. Thorne without legal grounds, you may be subject to civil penalties under County Code 221C, related to harassment of landowners." Her mouth opened, then closed. Donald squirmed in his seat. Cheryl looked like she wanted to disappear into the wood grain of the bench. The ruling was official. On paper. On camera. And in front of every HOA member who came to witness the hearing, hoping for a win. Instead, they saw their queen stripped of her borrowed crown. Back at the ranch that evening, Nate handed me a USB. "What's this?" I asked. "Our greatest hits," he said with a grin. "Every interaction, every threat, every absurd moment, cut, edited, and ready to roll." I uploaded it to YouTube under the title, "HOA tries to claim my private lake, then this happens." By the next morning, it had 92,000 views. 2 local papers ran stories on it. A blog picked it up and labeled it, "The Jet Ski Justice Saga." Karen didn't show her face for a week. When she did, it was to supervise the removal of the fence. As mandated, I stood on my porch, arms crossed, watching the wooden panels get ripped out and piled into a trailer. "Hope your labradoodle recovers," I called out. She didn't respond, just climbed into her SUV and drove off. Days passed. The HOA quieted. My inbox filled with emails, some from supporters, others from folks who had suffered under similar neighborhood tyrants. A man in Arizona told me he was fighting his own battle over a backyard greenhouse. A woman in Oregon said her HOA banned wind chimes. Each story felt like a reflection of mine. Small people with big power trying to push a little harder than the law allowed. I realized something then. Something that had been building quietly in my gut since the first knock on my door. They weren't just picking a fight with me. They were testing how far fear could go. But I didn't scare easily. And now, neither did the thousands of people who watched my story. That weekend, I took the jet ski out again. The water sparkled under the noon sun. Nate filmed from the shore, capturing a wide shot of me gliding across the lake, alone, unbothered, and utterly free. As I turned toward the far edge near Oak Hollow Estates, I slowed. A few families stood along their community path, watching. Some waved. I waved back. Not all HOA members were the problem, but the ones who tried to rule with fear. They'd learned something important. I wasn't going anywhere, and my lake, it was just getting started.